Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Queen Elizabeth, A Day in Her Life. Today we're going to see what happened once the Duke abdicated. Edward was hoping he could move back to England and get work there, but it wasn't that easy. So let's see what happened. The Duke was not to return to England because his finances were going to be taken away if he did. According to theguardian.com/UK, the Duke wrote a 7-page letter written from the villa he was staying at in Cannes a year after his abdication. It revealed his resentment at what had amounted to the government blackmail over his financial matters. The Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, drew up what was called an aide-memoire, an unofficial written summary of some agreement, proposal, or action. So this document was drawn up following discussions with Edward's solicitors in December of 1937, warning him that he could only return to England by prior permission of his younger brother, George VI, who was now king, acting on the advice of government. Authorities were afraid that Edward would challenge the king's position. The paper stated permission would be refused if his presence was deemed contrary to the public interest. For example, if it created or seemed likely to create a state of feeling that might lead to public demonstrations or disorder. So, to avoid public controversy, the ministers would doubtless feel obligated to advise His Majesty to suspend payments to the Duke. The whole matter came about because the King George VI, was dissatisfied with the financial situation because David grossly minimized his assets in discussions with his brother in the days before the abdication. "I'm not seeking to reproach you or anyone," George VI wrote to him a few months later in an already published letter, "but the fact remains that I was completely misled." When Edward saw the document that Neville Chamberlain had drawn up, he wrote a 7-page letter to Neville Chamberlain in anger, saying, "I never intended, nor would I ever have agreed to renounce my native land or my right to return to it for all time. If my understanding of the present situation is correct, it is now proposed that my personal freedom in this respect be linked with a private family arrangement on financial matters which my brother, the present king, made with me the day before I abdicated, in such a way that he would be permitted to break his private agreement with me if I were to exercise my right to visit my country without first obtaining his approval under the advice of his ministers. I regard such a proposal as both unfair and intolerable, as it would be tantamount to my accepting payment for remaining in exile. Further, having always been very sensitive to public opinion, I could never remain long in any country where I felt my presence was unwelcome. It's hardly necessary for me to repeat to you my loyalty to my brother as king, nor as a patriotic Englishman could I countenance disruptive action in others. There were negotiations with the Duke's solicitors regarding the document. In January 1938, Sir Horace Wilson, the government's chief industrial advisor, offered to go to Paris privately to talk with the Duke's solicitor, George Allen, to explain the matters to him. So Edward lived the rest of his life in exile, mainly in Paris, only occasionally returning to Britain for very brief visits. So Bertie and David, they got along well until Wallis Simpson appeared. When the brothers were growing up, they got along well together, and when Wallis Simpson appeared, things changed. When Bertie learned of the affair, he believed his brother was being dominated by the brash, twice-married Mrs. Simpson. Their father was also wary of the eldest son's state of mind. He said, "When I'm dead, the boy will ruin himself in 12 months. Because she was a divorcee, David, being king of the Anglican Church, wasn't allowed to marry her. So this caused a rift between David and Wallis and Bertie and Elizabeth, who was later known as the Queen Mother. And during one trip to Belvedere, Elizabeth was appalled when Simpson broke protocol and welcomed them instead of deferring to the king. So it was a deliberate and calculated display of power. According to one account, the Duchess recognized it as such. Walking straight past Wallis and ignoring her attempted welcome, she said, as if to no one in particular, "I came to dine with the king." The Duke of York looked embarrassed and very nervous, and the king looked rather startled. So in 1937, everyone could tell that David was getting miserable, restless, and seriously considering abdication. Biographer Alexander Larman, author of The Crown in Crisis, Countdown to the Abdication, said, "Bertie's initial attitude to the abdication crisis was one of disbelief. Like the rest of his family, he'd been brought up to believe in the idea of duty to his country, and above all, duty to the crown," says Larman. So the concept that his brother could simply choose to throw it all away was a deeply distressing one for him. exacerbated by the interfamiliar tensions it created, not the least with their mother. According to the author, Edward's selfishness and thoughtlessness was a guiding principle all through his life, and it seemed to be that he could do what he liked and damn the consequences and the feelings of others. So Bertie felt sick about the abdication. Both brothers had shook hands, and Edward went outside, and he said he felt like a swimmer emerging from a deep depth of water when he got the abdication details over with. But they stopped behaving like gentlemen once George VI became the king. Two issues became a source of trouble. So David was upset about Wallis not having the HRH title that she so wanted, and then there was money as an issue too. The author Lawman said Edward believed that he should be granted a pension from the royal family out of gratitude for his services, but he also lied about the extent of his own personal wealth. So it was then that Edward started harassing the king. Edward would call his brother Bertie up, mentioning the title of the HRS for Wallis and money matters. Well, the king was aware that while Windsor was asking for more money from the crown, he actually had more sizable fortune raised from his estates when he was the Prince of Wales than he let on. So Edward, he was a quick one when he was on the phone, but Bertie was slower because of his speech impediment. And also at this time, Bertie was overwhelmed with his kingly duties and the situation in Europe, which was troubling too. So Bertie stopped taking Edward's calls. And a friend of Edward saw the look on Edward's face when he wasn't granted his request. The friend said he couldn't believe it. He'd been so used to having everything done as he wishes. I'm afraid he's going to have many more shocks like this. So the Duke had underestimated his little brother's grit and determination, which their late father had always recognized. Well, Bertie's wife, Elizabeth, was angry with both Edward and Wallis for ruining her husband's life. Queen Elizabeth was the main force behind the royal family having nothing to do with Wallis, and this, of course, caused anger in Edward and Wallis. Privately, Wallis referred to the Queen as Mrs. Temple and Cookie and mocked her homeliness and unglamorous appearance. The Duke of Windsor was just as bitter, referring to his royal female relations as those ice-veined beachaws. So Queen Elizabeth shared this hatred of Simpson with a good portion of the public, according to Larman. Simpson was frightened by the anger from the public, but she was furious at her husband's family. She believed George VI had turned his brother into an outcast and that the Duke should let the world know. So at this point, Edward formed new bonds. Edward decided he would have a new life, and he started to hang out with Nazi members. Not a good idea. This compromised their integrity, and this made the country feel they couldn't trust Edward or Wallis. An associate of Edward said that all he did was talk about the king, and he felt he was haunted by him. And the Duke of Kent, who was the younger brother of Edward and Bertie, wrote to a friend and said, "What about David and Wallis? Apparently his interview at Buckingham Palace consisted only of talking about himself. Thank God, though, they've left the country, as it's very tricky having him here, and you never know what they're up to. I wonder if you saw them or heard any dirt about them." So England decided it would be better to get Edward out of the country because of his Nazi ties. So he was offered the governorship of the far-off Bahamas, and the Duke begrudgingly accepted, although the Duchess referred to the post as the Alba of 1940. So the Windsors soon found plenty of British and European expats to party with on what Edward referred to as a third-class British colony. After the war, Edward hoped he could go back home, but Bertie, he didn't trust Edward or Wallis after the discovery of secret Nazi files in 1945. In that documents the extent of the Duke of Windsor's contact with the Hitler regime. The documents meant that the king could not have a relationship with his brother or his wife. The author Larman said the king refused to accept that Wallis could ever be given a royal title, and by extension ever admitted it back into the royal family. The brothers met for the last time in 1949, and at this time Bertie was in poor health, and Edward was again requesting a title for Wallis and a residence in England. Bertie remained strong and denied his request, and after the meeting, the king wrote an emotional, long letter to his brother. Bertie said to his brother that his selfish exit had left a ghastly void that he wouldn't acknowledge. He wrote to Edward that it was his decision to leave the throne. And Bertie also wrote to Edward, how could he possibly claim that the present position was an insult to his wife, reasoned the king, when as a duchess, Wallis had been bestowed the highest rank in the English peerage. If she were to receive an HRH now, there is no reason why she should not have become queen in 1937. it would not make sense of the past. Yeah, he was right about that. So I guess Edward was pretty angry because he didn't reply to the letter for 6 months. And when he did, it was only to inform his brother that he had written a serialized autobiographical account of his life for Life magazine. And then in 1950, he would publish his autobiography, A King's Story. George VI died in 1952, and Queen Elizabeth never forgave Wallace and Edward for his early death. Edward attended the funeral, but he didn't seem to be broken up about it. He was acting cheerful because he was back in the public eye. Then Edward and Wallace moved to Paris. So once Edward was in France, he gave up hope of getting work in England. He discovered that no one really wanted him. According to the book The Windsor Story, never again did he try to do anything useful or constructive on a larger scale than his garden. The same held true of Wallace. It wasn't exactly a fairy tale, those years exiled. Edward had no job, and he wasn't interested in literature, music, or art. His only enthusiasms were gardening, money, golf, and the Duchess. The Duchess felt she had to entertain him to keep him from being bored, and it was exhausting. She once admitted, "I was frightened in his first years of idleness after the war. I realized I had to take the place of the king's boxes, the red dispatch cases that used to bring him his daily business of state and from Whitehall." And she worked at being a consort, but years afterward she told an American friend, "You have no idea how hard it is to live out a great romance." The Duchess found out that she was even more of an outcast than her husband was. In their later years, those that knew the Windsors were surprised that they never really were involved with the French community. They lived in France, and mainly in Paris, for 30 years, and they had no close French friends, and they made no effort to understand the French, and they did not like them. So Edward, at the end of his life, never regretted his marriage to Wallace. He loved her deeply, and the Duchess loved him too. And if one good thing came out of the abdication in regards to events in Edward's life, his marriage to Wallace was his greatest joy. So in an interview with Edward R. Murrow on his show Person to Person, Edward said that a clash with the establishment would have been inevitable even if he had not married Wallace, but that he had no regrets over his abdication. He said he would have liked to have reigned longer, but he wanted to do it under his own conditions, so he didn't have any regrets. And he said, "But I've taken an interest in my country, which is Britain, your land and mine, and I wish it well." And when Wallace was asked if she had any regrets, she replied, "Oh, about certain things, yes. I wish it could have been different. I mean, I'm extremely happy. We've had some hard times, but who hasn't? Some of us just have to learn to live with that. And I think happiness is a great secret." So it seemed like Edward was self-centered. As one writer stated, he seemed to be used to getting what he wanted when he wanted. He wasn't used to being told no. His brother Bertie was in disbelief when Edward stepped down, because they had been trained since their early years to be devoted to country, devoted to duty, and devoted to the crown. And it really affected him how Edward could just walk away from his responsibilities. In hindsight, the right man took the crown. Who knows what would have happened to the United Kingdom if King Edward had remained on the throne. So I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, if you could give it a thumbs up, it'll help the algorithm and help my videos get shown to even more viewers. I also hope that everyone's been having a good day, and tune in again soon to another episode of Queen Elizabeth, A Day in Her Life. Thank you. Bye.